Marin had not planned on opening the door that night. The storm had been building since midday, and by the time darkness fell over the mountain village of Halvord, the wind was howling so hard that the windows in her small cabin shook in their frames. She had made her tea, pulled her wool blanket around her shoulders, and sat beside the fireplace with a notebook full of field observations she had been meaning to organize for weeks. The fire was warm. The tea was hot. She had every reason to stay exactly where she was. Then something hit the door. Not the wind, not a branch. It was a weight, a heavy, soft, deliberate weight, and it landed against the base of her door with a sound that stopped her breath. She set down her cup slowly. Outside, the storm screamed. Inside, there was only silence and the low crackle of the fire. Marin Solberg was 31 years old, and she had lived alone on the edge of the Halvord wilderness for nearly 3 years. She was a wildlife biologist. She had spent long months tracking animals through snow, logging behavior patterns, measuring tracks, and recording sounds in the dark. She was not someone who frightened easily, but she was also smart enough to know that the wilderness did not always send friendly visitors to your door in the middle of a blizzard. She crossed the cabin quietly, picking up the long flashlight from the shelf near the door as she passed. She held it the way her father had once taught her, with weight behind it, ready to be used as more than a light source if needed. She peered through the small frosted window beside the door, but the snow was too thick to see anything clearly. Just whiteness and movement, and darkness beyond it. The sound came again, softer this time, almost like breathing. Marin made a decision that she would think about many times in the months that followed. She unlocked the door. She opened it, just a few inches at first, letting a blade of cold air and snow cut into the warmth of the cabin. Then she looked down. He was enormous. The wolf lay collapsed on her front porch, half buried in the drift that had built up against the cabin wall. His fur was thick and gray, the color of storm clouds, and it was matted with snow, and something darker near his left hind leg. He was breathing. She could see his sides moving, slow and labored, and a faint mist rose from his muzzle with each exhale. His eyes were closed. One massive paw was outstretched, and the tips of his claws had dug shallow grooves into the wooden planks of the porch, as though he had dragged himself the last few inches to her door. Marin stood very still. In all her years of fieldwork, she had observed wolves from a distance. She had studied their tracks, their howls, their behavioral patterns. She had never, not once, been this close to a wild wolf. The size of him was something she had not been prepared for, even with all her knowledge. He was not a thin or sickly animal. Even collapsed and unconscious, he radiated a kind of dense, heavy power that made the air feel different around him. The blood near his hind leg was fresh. Not a lot of it, but enough to tell her the wound was real and recent. She could call someone. She knew that was the reasonable thing to do. Her phone was on the table. Animal control in the nearest town was 40 minutes away on a good night, and this was not a good night. The roads would be closed, the emergency line would put her on hold, and this wolf, whatever had happened to him, would be dead from cold and blood loss before anyone arrived. Marin was not built for waiting when something in front of her needed help. She went back inside, grabbed the thickest blanket from the bed, and returned to the porch. She worked carefully and slowly, talking in a low, steady voice the whole time, the way she always did when approaching any animal. She told him she was not going to hurt him. She told him she only wanted to help. She did not know if he could hear her. She thought it was possible that he could not, but she spoke anyway, because silence felt wrong, and because the sound of her voice was the only thing keeping her hands steady. Getting him inside was not easy. He was deadweight, and he was heavy, far heavier than any dog she had ever moved. She worked his front half first, sliding the blanket beneath him as best she could, then pulling carefully, moving him a few inches at a time across the porch and through the doorway. The whole process took almost 20 minutes. By the end of it, she was sweating despite the cold, and her back ached, and the wolf's breathing had grown noticeably more shallow. She kicked the door shut with her heel and dropped to her knees beside him. The wound on his hind leg was a deep gash, running along the outside of his upper leg. It had stopped bleeding heavily, but it was jagged and raw, and the surrounding fur was stiff with cold and dried blood. Marin had basic field medical supplies, the kind she always kept on hand because she spent months at a time in places where a hospital was not a quick drive away. She had antiseptic. She had gauze. She had tape and small curved scissors. She had pain relief she could not give him, because she did not know his weight precisely, and did not want to make it worse. She cleaned the wound. She was careful and thorough, and she talked the entire time, keeping her voice low and level. He did not wake up. He twitched once, when she touched the deepest part of the gash, a single, powerful flinch that made her pull back instinctively, but then he went still again. When the wound was as clean as she could make it, she wrapped it in gauze and secured it. Then she built the fire higher and pulled the heavy bedroom quilt off the bed and spread it over him. He was still cold to the touch, the kind of deep cold that had settled into the bones, and she knew that the blanket alone might not be enough. She hesitated for a moment. Then she lay down beside him on the floor. She pressed the length of her body against his side, the way she had read was done in survival cases when hypothermia was a concern and no other heat source was available. She could feel the slow beat of his heart against her arm. She could feel the rise and fall of his breath. She kept one hand resting lightly on his side, monitoring the rhythm of it, alert to any change. The fire crackled. The storm raged outside. Inside the cabin, everything was still. Maren did not sleep. She lay there through the long hours of the night, watching the fire and listening to the wolf breathe, and thinking about what had happened to him. Wolves in the Halvard Range did not often come close to human habitation. They were shy animals, careful and deliberate, and a healthy wolf would not have collapsed on someone's porch. Something had hurt him badly enough to drive him here. Something had left him with no other option. She thought about the tracks she had found the previous week during her morning survey. Large tracks, much larger than a typical wolf, cutting across the eastern slope in a straight, purposeful line. She had measured them and noted the unusual size in her field journal, thinking it was probably a dominant male. She had not followed them. Now she wondered if she should have. By around 3 in the morning, the wolf's breathing had improved. It was still slow, but steadier, less labored. The shivering had stopped. His body temperature felt warmer against her arm. She sat up quietly and looked at him in the firelight. His eyes were open. She had not heard him wake. He had simply opened his eyes, and now he was watching her with an expression that she could not name. It was not fear. It was not aggression. It was something calmer than either of those things, something that looked, in the amber glow of the fire, almost like recognition. Maren held very still. She knew that a wolf in this situation, confused, injured, indoors, could react in a number of ways, and not all of them would end well for her. She kept her hands visible, and her body relaxed, and she met his gaze very carefully, not with the direct challenge of a stare, but with the soft, sideways eye contact she used in the field when she needed an animal to know she was not a threat. He looked at her for a long time. Then he closed his eyes again. She let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. At some point before dawn, exhaustion finally won, and she slept, curled on the floor with the quilt half over her, and the wolf's warmth at her back. When she woke, gray winter light was coming through the window, and the fire had burned low to red coals. She sat up, stiff and cold, and turned to check on him. He was gone. The blanket was pushed back neatly, which was strange in itself, because wolves did not push blankets back neatly. The gauze wrapping she had applied to his leg was lying on the floor beside where he had been, still intact, as though it had been removed carefully rather than torn away. The front door was closed. She was certain she had not left it unlocked. Maren stood in the middle of her cabin and looked at the space where he had been. She looked at the blanket. She looked at the bandaging on the floor. She looked at the door. Then she looked down at the wooden floor, and her breath stopped. There were footprints, not paw prints, footprints. The kind made by large, bare human feet, still damp from the melted snow that had clung to what was apparently skin, walking in a straight line from the spot where the wolf had been lying to the front door. Maren stood there for a very long time without moving. She was a scientist. She believed in evidence and observation and logical explanation. She believed in the things she could measure and record and replicate. She believed in the natural world as she had always understood it. And she stood in her cabin on a winter morning, looking at the footprints of a man who had not been there when she fell asleep, left behind in the exact place where an enormous gray wolf had been, and she had absolutely no explanation for what she was seeing. She crossed to her notebook on the table. She opened it to a fresh page. She wrote down everything. The time she had found the wolf, the condition of the wound, the gauze, the blanket, the footprints, the size of them, the direction they walked. the state of the door. She wrote it all down carefully and precisely, the way she always recorded Data, because Data did not lie, and Data did not panic, and Data was the only thing that was going to help her understand what had happened in her cabin last night. She measured the footprints before they dried. She photographed them with her phone. She noted that the stride length was consistent with a man of significant height, probably above 6 feet, walking at a calm and deliberate pace toward the door. Then she put her coat on, made fresh tea, and sat down at the table to think. Outside, the storm had passed. The world was white and silent and glittering, and in the distance, through the trees, a pair of ravens called back and forth to each other, across the clean, cold air. Maren wrapped both hands around her mug and looked out at the snow-covered porch where, just hours ago, a wolf had been dying. She was not afraid, exactly. Fear would have been simpler. What she felt was something more complicated than that, a deep, humming awareness that something had shifted overnight, that the world she had been living in, quietly and calmly for 3 years, had just tilted on its axis, and that the footprints drying on her cabin floor were only the beginning of whatever came next. She finished her tea. She opened her notebook again. She drew a line under the last thing she had written, and below it, she wrote a single question. "What are you?" She looked at the words for a moment. Then she closed the notebook and went to refill her cup, because she had a feeling she was going to need it. And somewhere in the tree line, beyond the edge of the white and frozen world outside her window, something watched the light in her cabin with amber eyes, and did not move, and did not leave. The morning after was too quiet. Maren noticed it the moment she stepped outside to check her equipment. The birds that usually called from the birch trees along the eastern boundary of her property were silent. The small fox that sometimes crossed her clearing at dawn was nowhere to be seen. Even the wind had gone still, the kind of stillness that felt less like calm and more like everything around her was holding its breath, waiting. She told herself it was just the aftermath of the storm. She told herself the silence had a perfectly reasonable explanation. She was very good at telling herself things, and she was very good at believing them, right up until the moment the evidence made them impossible to hold. She spent the morning reviewing her field notes from the previous 2 weeks, cross-referencing the unusual tracks she had recorded on the eastern slope with the known behavioral data for the Halvard wolf pack. By every measure she could apply, the tracks did not fit a standard pattern. They were too large, the stride too long, the depth in the snow suggesting a body weight significantly above what any wolf in the region should carry. She had written it off as an outlier. Now she was not so sure. She also noticed, for the first time, that the wound she had treated the night before had been more precise than she initially registered. Most injuries in wild animals came from terrain or conflict, jagged edges, tearing, irregular shapes. This wound had been a clean, deep gash along a very specific line on the outer leg, the kind of cut that suggested a sharp object moving in a controlled direction, not a rock, not a branch, not the bite of another animal. Something with an edge had done this, something deliberate. That detail sat in her chest like a stone all morning. She walked into the village of Halvord just before noon. It was a small place, the kind of village that had existed at the edge of the mountain for hundreds of years without much changing. A cluster of timber houses, a general store, a small post building, a church with a green copper roof, and a square in the center where the older residents gathered on good weather days to talk about things that had happened long before anyone else was paying attention. Today, the square was empty. The cold had kept most people inside, but she could see smoke rising from several chimneys and lights burning in windows. She stopped at the general store first, mostly to buy more gauze and antiseptic, because the supply she had used last night was now gone. Old Berta was behind the counter. Old Berta was always behind the counter. She was 76 years old and had run the store for more than 40 years, and she had a way of looking at people that made you feel she already knew what you were going to say before you opened your mouth. Maren set her items on the counter and mentioned, as casually as she could manage, that she had found an injured wolf on her porch the previous night. She said she had treated the wound and kept the animal warm until it recovered. She kept her voice neutral. She was watching Berta's face the way she watched animals in the field, alert to small changes, to the things the body showed before the mind decided what to say. Berta's hands stopped moving on the counter. It was just for a second. Just a pause, a half-breath of stillness, and then her hands resumed their work, straightening the items Maren had placed there. But the pause had been real, and Maren had seen it. You brought a wolf into your home, Berta said. Her voice was even, but something moved beneath it, the way something moves beneath ice when the current is running underneath. He was injured and going to die in the cold, Maren said. I treated the wound. He was gone by morning. Berta looked up at her then. Her eyes were pale blue, sharp, and very steady. She held Maren's gaze for a moment longer than felt comfortable. You should not have touched him, she said quietly. The king will know. Maren blinked. I'm sorry? But Berta was already wrapping her purchases, her movements brisk and efficient, and when she handed the bag across the counter, her expression had smoothed out into something pleasant and ordinary, the face of an old woman running a shop in a small village on a cold winter day. That will be 80 kroner, she said. Maren paid. She stood at the counter for a moment longer, waiting to see if anything else would come. Nothing did. She picked up her bag and walked out. She stood in the empty square for a moment, turning the words over in her mind. The king will know. She did not know what that meant. She did not know who Berta was referring to. There was no king in Norway, not in the traditional sense, not someone who governed a mountain village in the north. The phrase had not been used the way someone says a name. It had been used the way someone says a warning. Over the next 2 days, she began to notice the way the village had changed around her. It was subtle at first, the kind of thing you might dismiss if you were not paying attention, and Maren was always paying attention. The fisherman who lived 2 houses down from the square gave her a long look when she passed, not unfriendly, but careful, assessing, the way you look at something you are trying to figure out. The woman who ran the small post building smiled at her with a strange expression, soft and a little sorry, the kind of smile people give when they feel something for you that they cannot say out loud. 2 teenagers she had never spoken to before stopped what they were doing when she walked past, and one of them, a girl with dark braided hair, looked at her with something that was very close to wonder. None of it was hostile. That was what made it difficult to name. If the village had been cold to her, or if someone had said something directly, she could have responded to it. Instead, it was this strange, surrounding feeling of being known, of being seen differently than she had been seen before, without anyone explaining why or what had changed. On the 3rd morning after the storm, she woke to find firewood stacked neatly on her porch, a full cord, dry and split, piled precisely against the wall. She had not ordered wood. She had not spoken to anyone about needing it. She stood in her doorway in the early morning cold and looked at the wood for a long time, and then she walked out to check the ground around it. There were no tire tracks, no boot prints in the fresh snow except her own from the previous day. Whatever had brought the wood here had come and gone, without leaving a mark. On the 4th morning, her broken fence along the northern edge of the property had been repaired. 3 posts that had been split by last autumn's heavy snowfall, which she had been meaning to fix for months, were now standing straight and solid, new wood, gleaming pale against the weathered gray of the old fence line. She stood at the fence for a while. Then she walked the perimeter of her property slowly, looking at the ground. The snow was undisturbed everywhere, except in one spot, along the tree line at the edge of the clearing, where something large had stood very still, for what appeared to be a very long time. She could see the impression in the snow, 4 deep marks, close together, and the rounded edges of what had pressed into the surface. She was kneeling beside the marks, photographing them, when she felt the watching. It was not a sound or a movement. It was a physical sensation, a pressure at the back of her neck, the particular awareness that something with intelligence was looking at you from a place you could not see. She had felt it before in the field, usually when a predator was nearby, but this was steadier than that, and it did not feel threatening. It felt like attention, focused, patient, quiet attention. She stood up slowly and turned to face the tree line. At the edge of the shadow, where the birch trees thinned before the older pines began, she saw him, the wolf. Her wolf, or the animal she had begun to think of that way, even though she knew it was not accurate, and probably not wise. He was standing perfectly still between 2 birch trunks, and in the gray morning light, his coat was the color of old ash and winter sky. He was watching her with those amber eyes, and they were clear and bright and entirely awake. She stood completely still. He did not move. She said, very softly, "I'm not going to hurt you." One ear turned slightly toward her voice. She said, "I know you know that already." He held her gaze for another long moment. Then, unhurried and without fear, He turned and walked deeper into the trees. She watched his shape until the pines swallowed it, until there was nothing left to see but shadows and the thin white trunks of birches. And then she stood alone in the clearing, in the cold and the quiet, and felt the absence of that watching gaze, like the absence of warmth. She went inside and sat at her table and opened her notebook to the page where she had written her question. 3 days ago, in the early morning after the storm. What are you? She looked at it for a while. Then she wrote beneath it, in the same careful handwriting, a new observation. He comes back every evening at dusk. He circles the cabin but does not enter. He watches from the tree line. He leaves before full dark. He knows I see him. He does not leave when I do. She stopped writing. She looked at what she had recorded. Then she added one final line. He is not wild. Or, he is not only wild. There is something else in him, and I do not have a category for it yet. She closed the notebook. Through the window, the sky above the mountain was turning the pale gold of late afternoon, and in 2 hours the light would go, and at the edge of the tree line she already knew, something would be standing there, watching her window with patient amber eyes. She made fresh tea, and sat by the fire, and waited for the evening. And in the back of her mind, Berta's words moved slowly, like something caught in a current. The king will know. She did not yet understand what that meant, but she was beginning to understand that it was not a warning she could ignore. The convoy appeared on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the storm, coming up the single road into Halvard from the valley below. Maren saw the dust rising before she heard the engines, which was unusual because in winter, there was rarely any vehicle traffic on that road, except the supply truck on Fridays. She was at the edge of her property, checking the equipment on one of her audio sensors, when the first black vehicle crested the hill, then a second, then a third. She stood and watched them pass on the road below her property line. They were large, dark, and moved with the kind of confident slowness that said their occupants were not concerned about arriving quickly, because arriving at all was already enough. She went back inside and kept working. Whatever had come into Halvard was not her business, and she had 2 weeks of audio data to review before her monthly report was due. She heard the sound of the vehicles stopping in the village square. She heard, faintly through the walls of the cabin, what she could only describe as a general stillness, the kind that falls over a small place when something significant arrives in it. She had experienced it before, in very remote communities she had worked in, when a government official or a regional authority showed up, and everyone suddenly became very conscious of standing correctly. She told herself it had nothing to do with her. At 10 minutes past 11, someone knocked on her door. Not one of her neighbors. She knew the knock of every person in Halvard who had ever come to her door, which was not many people, and this knock belonged to none of them. It was a single, firm knock, certain of itself, the kind of knock that does not ask whether you are home. She opened the door. The man standing on her porch was very tall. He had silver-gray hair cut short, and dark eyes that were almost black at this distance, and a face that was weathered in the way that outdoor cold weathers skin over many years, carved deep around the jaw and the brow. He was dressed practically, heavy coat, dark clothing, heavy boots, but none of it was rough. He wore it the way a person wears clothes they have chosen with attention, rather than grabbed from a pile. He was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately read. Not hostile, not friendly. Something more neutral and assessing than either of those. He was not alone. There were 2 other men behind him, standing back, and they were watching the surrounding property, with the kind of quiet alertness that had nothing casual about it. Maren Solberg, the man said. His voice was low, even, and it carried without effort. Yes, she said. I am Kale Draven, he said. I am the regional land authority for this district. She looked at him. She had been in the Halvard region for 3 years, and she had never heard of a regional land authority. She was familiar with the relevant government offices, the environmental protection agencies she worked with, the wildlife management boards she sent her data to. None of them had ever mentioned a Kale Draven or anything resembling his title. I was not aware the district had a regional land authority, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved very briefly in his expression, and she thought it might have been something close to respect. I need to speak with you, he said. It is about something that happened 3 weeks ago. She looked at him for a moment longer, then she stood back from the door. She did not offer him tea. She stood near the table with her arms folded and let him come inside, and she watched him look around the cabin, the way someone looks at a place when they are reading it for information. His eyes moved over the bookshelves, the equipment stacked by the wall, the notebooks on the table, the marks on the floor, where she had cleaned and recleaned the area where the wolf had lain. His eyes stopped on those marks for just a second. "You found an injured animal 3 weeks ago," he said, "during the storm." "I did," she said. "You brought it inside. He would have died otherwise." Cale turned to look at her fully. He said. She met his gaze. The animal was male. A brief silence passed between them. He looked at her with those dark, unreadable eyes, and she looked back at him with the kind of steady patience she had built over years of field work, because in her experience, the person who broke a silence first was usually the one who was more uncomfortable with it. He broke it. "What you did had consequences you are not yet aware of," he said. "Consequences for more than just yourself." "I saved an injured animal from dying in a blizzard," she said. "If that has consequences, I am happy to discuss them." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed very slightly, still controlled, still even, but carrying something beneath it that had not been there a moment ago, something that might have been the edge of frustration, or the edge of something more complicated. "The wolf you pulled into your home," he said, "into your bed. I kept him warm on the floor beside the fire," she said, "which is standard care for an animal with severe cold exposure. The wolf you kept warm," he said, adjusting, "is not simply an animal." She looked at him. He looked back. The silence in the cabin was very complete. "I need you to tell me what you mean by that," she said carefully. Cale moved to the window and looked out at the clearing. His back was to her now, and in the thin winter light coming through the glass he looked, for a moment, less like a government official and more like something older, something that had been standing in one form or another on the edge of this particular kind of wilderness for a very long time. "There are things in this world," he said, "that do not fit into the categories you have been trained to use. I am aware that this is not a comfortable thing to hear. I am not asking you to be comfortable with it." She said nothing. "The animal you sheltered was a young man from my community," he said. "His name is Elan. He was 24 years old when your storm came, and he had been injured during a territorial dispute that had nothing to do with you and nothing to do with this village." He turned back from the window. "By bringing him inside, by giving him warmth and care in the way you did, you activated something that our kind calls a bond claim. It is ancient. It is not a thing that can be undone, and it creates a situation that has now become, for a number of reasons, deeply complicated." Marin looked at him for a long time. "Your kind," she said. He held her gaze. She absorbed this. She was a scientist. She did not reach for explanations she could not support with evidence. But she also had photographs on her phone, of footprints left behind, by a man who had not been there when she fell asleep. She had measurements of tracks in the snow that did not fit any species in her database. She had the memory of amber eyes looking at her with something no animal had ever looked at her with before. She had 3 weeks of a wolf circling her property at dusk, with the patience and the deliberateness of a person keeping watch. She was a scientist, but she was also someone who followed the evidence wherever it led. "What does bond claim mean?" she asked. He told her. He was not gentle about it, and he was not apologetic about it. He explained, in a direct and measured way, that among his people, the act of offering warmth and safety to an injured member of their community created a formal recognition, a kind of ancient covenant, that marked the person who offered care as someone who had chosen to stand in protection of that individual. It was not romantic in origin. It had developed thousands of years ago as a way of protecting those who had been injured far from pack territory, a way of ensuring that whoever sheltered a wounded member was formally recognized and protected in return. Over generations it had become something more complex, something that carried obligations and claims that ran in both directions. The complication, he said, was that Elan had already been promised to someone else, another young woman from a powerful family in the south. The arrangement had been made a year ago. It was not a romantic arrangement exactly, but it was significant, and it carried its own weight of obligation and alliance. And now, because of a blizzard, and a woman who could not leave a suffering creature on her porch in the cold, it was in pieces. "This is not your fault," he said. and there was a flatness to the way he said it that told her he was working to be fair rather than feeling it naturally. "But," she said. He met her eyes. "But you have made it significantly more difficult to resolve." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, with a precision that she used when she needed to be understood exactly, and not approximately, "I found an injured living creature who was going to die in the cold. I brought him inside. I cleaned his wound. I kept him warm. And you are telling me that has created a problem for your community?" "Yes," he said. "Then the problem," she said, "is with your community's laws, not with what I did." He looked at her, and she looked back. And for a long moment, the only sound in the cabin was the low crackle of the fire, and outside the window, the mountain stood white and cold and indifferent, and somewhere in the tree line, she was almost certain, something was watching the cabin with amber eyes and waiting to see what happened next. Cale's jaw tightened very slightly. He was not used to being answered that way, she could see it. But he did not argue with her, and he did not raise his voice, and he did not do what she had half expected, which was to retreat into authority and demand she comply with something. Instead, he said, quietly and without heat, "You should have left him outside." She said, just as quietly, "I could not do that." They looked at each other across the small, warm cabin. And Maren understood, in that moment, that whatever came next was not going to be simple, and that the man standing in her home was not simply an administrator with a title she had never heard of. He was something else. Something older. Something that carried the weight of a world she had never known existed, and that world had just walked through her front door and placed itself, squarely and without warning, in the middle of her life. Outside, across the square, she could feel the village watching. And somewhere far to the south, a young woman who did not yet know what had happened was going about her day, unaware that a snowstorm, and a biologist with a blanket and a fire had just rewritten something that was supposed to have been settled. Cale looked at her one more time. Then he turned and walked to the door. He paused there, his hand on the frame, and without turning back he said, "I will return, Miss Solberg." It did not sound like a threat. It did not sound like a promise, exactly, either. It sounded like a fact. He left, the door closed behind him. She heard the engines start in the square below, heard the convoy pull away, and then the village was quiet again, the way small places go quiet after something large has moved through them. Maren stood in the center of her cabin and breathed. Then she went to her notebook, opened it, and started a new page. She wrote the name Cale Draven at the top. Below it she wrote, "Regional Land Authority, unknown agency, unknown jurisdiction, silver gray hair, dark eyes, above 6 feet. Commands both deference and silence from the village of Halvord. Claims the wolf is a man named Alon, age 24. Claims I activated something called a bond claim by giving him warmth and medical care during the blizzard. Claims this is a complication for his community." She stopped writing. She looked at what she had recorded. Then she wrote one more line. He said, "Your kind." He did not say our kind by mistake. He knows exactly what he is saying. She put the pen down. She sat very still. Outside, the afternoon light was shifting toward the long gold of early evening, and the clearing beyond her window was empty and white and absolutely still, and in about 2 hours, she knew, at the edge of the tree line, 2 amber eyes would appear and watch her window through the dark. She picked the pen back up, and she began, slowly and carefully, to write down every question she had. Maren did not go looking for Alon. She had decided, the morning after Cale Draven's visit, that she would not seek out anyone from the community he had described. She was a guest in this mountain, a scientist on a contract that ran through the spring, and she had enough professional sense to understand that walking into an unknown community's internal situation and asking questions was not going to help anything. She would do her work. She would observe. She would wait. Alon came to her. He appeared at her door 4 days after the convoy left, just before dusk, the hour when the light went honey gold through the birch trees and the air smelled of pine resin and coming cold. She heard the knock, lighter than Cale's, and with a hesitation in it that the older man's had not had, and she opened the door to find a young man she had never seen before standing on her porch. He was tall, but not as tall as Cale. His hair was dark, almost black, and his eyes, when the light caught them at the right angle, were very slightly amber at the center. He was wearing a heavy coat and a worn scarf, and he looked, in all visible ways, like an ordinary young man, standing on someone's porch, unsure whether he had made a good decision in coming. He said, "I am Ilan." Maren looked at him. She was not surprised, which told her something about herself, about how much the past 3 weeks had shifted her internal sense of what was possible. "Come in," she said. She made coffee, because it gave her hands something to do, and it gave them both something to do with the silence, which was present and significant. He sat at her table, and held the mug in both hands, and did not speak right away, and she respected that, and sat across from him and waited. When he did speak, the first thing he said was, "I am sorry." She studied his face. He was young. That was the thing that struck her most, not in appearance only, but in some quality that lived behind his eyes, something that had not yet fully decided what it was. He was 24, and he carried something heavy, the way young people do, when they have been handed responsibilities they did not choose. "You do not need to apologize for nearly dying in a blizzard," she said. He shook his head. "I don't mean that. I mean I'm sorry for what I brought to your door. What I brought to your life. You didn't choose to be injured," she said. "No," he said, "but I chose to drag myself toward your light." She looked at him. It was an honest thing to say, and it changed the shape of the conversation. He told her, slowly and without the polished certainty that Cale had used, the fuller version of what he was. He told it the way someone tells something they have carried privately for a long time, with pauses, and with the occasional backtrack of someone who is trying to get the words right. He was a shifter. His family had been part of the Halvard mountain range for generations, as long as anyone in the community could remember. Cale was the Alpha King, the head of the largest and most established pack in the northern region, and his authority was both practical and ceremonial, the kind of authority that had grown from centuries of structure and was not easily questioned. The pack had rules, old ones. The bond claim was among the oldest and among the most binding, and it had been created in an era when the community's survival depended on ironclad obligations between individuals and between families. It had never been meant as a trap. It had never been meant to cause harm. But it was what it was, and by the laws that Cale was responsible for maintaining, the fact that Maren had sheltered Ilan and given him warmth and medical care during a period of mortal danger had created a formal recognition between them. The problem, Ilan said, was that he had been promised to another family, a young woman named Cora, from the southern pack led by an elder named Bertrand. The arrangement was a year old, and had been made in good faith, by his family and by Bertrand's, as a way of building connection between the two communities, which had been at odds over territory for more than a decade. Ilan had not been asked whether he wanted it. That was not how it worked, or had not been, until recently, when a small number of voices in the community had begun to say that perhaps it should be. He had been on his way back from a meeting with Bertrand's people when the fight had happened. 2 younger members of Bertrand's pack, his own age, had disagreed with something he had said about territory markers. The fight had been brief, and he had made it out, but the wound on his leg had been deep, and in the dark and the cold of the coming storm, he had lost his direction and found himself on the edge of the village. And there had been a light in a window. "I knew it was a human home," he said. "I knew what I should do, which was to keep moving, or find the tree cover and wait out the storm. I knew the risks. I knew the rules." He looked down at the mug in his hands. "But I was cold, and I was bleeding, and the light was there. And something in me, something I can't explain, turned toward it." Maren thought about that for a moment. "I'm glad you did," she said. He looked up at her. Something in his expression shifted. "Cale doesn't see it that way." "I know," she said. He made that clear. Ilan was quiet for a moment. He's not wrong. From where he stands, he has to maintain the structure. He has to protect the agreements. The bond claim complicates Cora's situation and her family's expectations, and Bertrand is not a man who takes complications well. He set the mug down. "But I also think he's not entirely right, and I think, somewhere underneath the authority, he knows that too." Maren looked at him with interest. "What makes you say that?" Ilan met her eyes. "Because he came to you personally," he said. "Cale could have sent anyone to deliver that message. He has 24 people in this region who carry his authority, and who could have stood in your cabin and told you what you needed to know. He came himself. He paused. Kale doesn't do things he doesn't need to do personally, which means there was something about this situation that he felt required him specifically. Marin thought about the man who had stood in her cabin, with that controlled, careful voice, who had looked at the marks on her floor, where a wolf had lain, and who had said you should have left him outside, with an expression that was not quite as hard as it was trying to be. "What happens now?" she asked. Alon was honest. He said he did not know exactly. The bond claim was acknowledged, but not yet formally activated, which meant it existed as a recognized state, but did not yet carry the full weight of obligation. It would once both parties formally accepted it. He had no intention of pushing her toward anything she did not understand or want. He had come, he said, simply because he owed her a face and a name and a real explanation, not a controlled briefing from an authority. The truth, plainly spoken, from the person it actually concerned. She appreciated that. They talked for a long time after that, longer than she had expected. She asked questions, the way she always did when something new presented itself, carefully and specifically, pulling at the details, trying to understand the structure of things. He answered with a patience that surprised her, and sometimes with a dry, quiet humor that surprised her more. He was not what she had imagined, sitting across from her in her cabin, with his hands around a mug of coffee. He was complicated, and careful, and young, in ways that had nothing to do with his age. When he left, the sky outside was fully dark. She walked him to the door, and he paused on the porch, looking out at the clearing, the way he had looked at it many times before in a different form. "Do you still come?" she asked. "In the evenings?" He glanced at her. A small, surprised look. "Yes," he said. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because you leave the light on." She looked at the warm rectangle of light her cabin window threw out across the snow. "I leave it on because I am usually still awake," she said. He nodded. "I know," he said, "but it helps to see it anyway." He walked across the clearing and into the tree line without looking back. She stood in the doorway and watched until the darkness had taken him. Then she went inside, sat at her table, and opened her notebook. She wrote, in her precise and careful handwriting, everything he had said, every detail, every name, every piece of structure she could remember. And at the end, after she had finished recording, she sat back and looked at the page and thought about what it meant to be someone who always left the light on. Then she closed the notebook, banked the fire, and went to bed. Outside, at the edge of the tree line, nothing moved. But something was there, and it stayed until nearly midnight before it finally, quietly, went away. Everything changed when the snowfall came in from the east. It was not the dramatic, crashing snowfall of the storm that had started everything. This was quieter. A steady, fine, persistent snow that settled over Halvard and the mountain above it, with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. It began on a Sunday, and it did not stop for 4 days. By Wednesday, the roads out of the valley were closed. The supply truck was not coming, and the village had drawn in on itself, the way small mountain communities do when the weather decides to hold them still for a while. Marin had enough supplies. She had learned, in her first winter in Halvard, to keep at least 3 weeks of food and fuel at any time, because 3 weeks was how long it could take for the weather to change its mind. She was comfortable, and she had her work, and she told herself the enforced solitude was actually useful, because it gave her time to organize the months of data she had been putting off. But the snow did something else. The snow changed things she had not expected to be changeable. On the first morning of the steady snowfall, she walked her perimeter as usual, and found that the tracks she had grown used to seeing at the edge of the tree line, the circular route that Alon had walked in his other form, watching her cabin from the shadows, were gone. Not erased by fresh snow, but deliberately absent, as though he had decided not to come. She noted this in her log, and said nothing of it to herself. On the second morning, the same. No tracks. The snow was even and undisturbed along the tree line. On the third morning, she sat at her table for a long time before starting work, and she did not look at the tree line, because she had decided she was not going to be someone who kept checking the tree line. She checked the tree line. Nothing. She went back to her data and worked with more concentration than usual, the kind of concentration that is actually the mind using work to cover something it does not want to look at directly. On the afternoon of the third day, her phone rang. The caller was Cale Draven. She answered without entirely knowing why. He could have come in person. He had done it before. The fact that he was calling instead of appearing on her doorstep told her something about the current state of things. "The Southern Pack has sent envoys," he said, without preamble or greeting. "They arrived this morning. They are aware of the bond claim situation." "How?" she asked. "News moves in our community the way it moves in any small community," he said, quickly, and without anyone's permission. She heard something in his voice that she had not heard before. A tightness, a controlled quality that was slightly more controlled than usual, which in a man like Cale was its own form of telling. "What do they want?" she asked. "They want the bond claim formally dissolved," he said. "They are calling it an illegitimate claim, on the grounds that it occurred in a human dwelling, with a human party, who was unaware of its significance." "That seems like a reasonable argument," she said carefully. "It would be," he said, "except that our law does not make exceptions for awareness. The act itself creates the claim. The understanding of all parties is not required. That is ancient and established, and not something I can rewrite." She was quiet for a moment. "And Cora," she said. "What does she want?" A pause. "Cora has not been consulted." Marin absorbed that. "That seems like a significant oversight." Another pause, longer this time. "You and I," he said, "appear to agree on more things than I expected." She sat with that for a moment. He said, "The envoys are asking me to take action. Specifically, they are asking me to require you to sign a formal disclaimer, a document disavowing the claim and releasing Elan from its implications. Under our law, if the human party in a bond claim formally disavows it, the claim loses its standing." She looked at the wall of her cabin, at the notebooks stacked on the shelf, at the photographs pinned above her workstation, field images from 3 years of work in this mountain, this particular valley, this specific ecosystem she had come to know as well as she knew anything. "And if I refuse?" she said. He was quiet. "I am asking," she said, "because I want to understand the options. I am not telling you what I am going to do." He said slowly, "If you refuse, the claim remains acknowledged. The Southern Pack will register a formal objection. Bertrand will use it as leverage in ongoing territory negotiations, and this village, and the people in it, will be caught between two competing pressures." He said it honestly, without exaggeration, without using it as a threat, just as a clear laying out of consequences, which she had come to understand was how he communicated when he was being genuinely straight with her, rather than managing her. "I see," she said. "I am not asking you to decide now," he said. "I know," she said. "But I want to ask you something first." He waited. "When you told me that I made things complicated," she said, "did you believe that? Did you believe I had done something wrong?" The silence that followed was the longest of any she had had with him. Then he said, and his voice was different now, quieter, and without the formal edge, "No, I believed you had done something human, and I know the difference." She looked at the wall for a moment longer. "I'll call you back," she said. She hung up. She sat at her table. The snow fell outside in its quiet, relentless way, and the village was still and white and contained, and somewhere across the square she knew, people were watching her cabin and wondering what she was going to do. She opened her notebook. She wrote down the question Cale had put to her. She wrote down the options. She wrote down what she knew and what she didn't know and what she believed. Then she sat with it for a long time. The fire burned low. She let it, for once, not getting up to add more wood, just sitting in the cooling room with the snow coming down outside, and her hands flat on the table, and her mind working through something that had no clean and easy answer. She could sign the disclaimer. It would resolve the immediate problem. It would release Elan from a situation he had not chosen, and allow the arrangement with Cora's family to proceed. It would remove the pressure from Halvard, and from the people in it, who had done nothing, except live their lives in the usual way. She could also do the other thing. At 11 that night, she picked up her phone and called Cale back. "I'm not signing it," she said. A silence. "Explain," he said. "I will not apologize for saving a life," she said. "I will not sign a document that frames what I did as an error requiring formal correction. I did not make a mistake. I did not harm anyone. If your law creates a problem from an act of basic human decency, then your law is what needs examination, not my actions. The silence lasted longer this time. Then, very quietly, Cale Draven said, I was hoping you would say something like that. She blinked. Were you? Yes, he said, because it gives me something to work with. She sat back in her chair. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and steady and indifferent, covering everything in a clean white layer, erasing the old shapes of things and leaving the world looking, for a little while, like something that had not yet made up its mind what it was going to be. Tell me what you are going to do, she said. And he did. Quietly, carefully, in a voice that was doing something she had not heard it do before. It was building something, rather than defending it. She listened to every word, and the snow kept falling, and the night stretched out long and cold, and full of things that were not yet decided. Maren had not expected to be the one standing in front of the elders. That was the first thing she noticed when she walked into the room in the old timber hall at the northern edge of the village, where Cale had told her the council would be meeting. She had expected to sit on the edge of something, to be present as a witness or a subject or a reference point. Instead, the moment she walked through the door, the quality of attention in the room told her that she was not the audience, she was the center. The hall was large and old, with heavy beams and a stone fireplace at the far end that was burning high and warm. There were perhaps 20 people in the room. Some she recognized from the village, others she had never seen before. People who had the look of travelers, people who had come from a distance for this specific gathering, and who carried themselves with the particular kind of composure that comes from knowing exactly why you are somewhere. The elders were seated in a long row at the far end. They ranged in age from perhaps 50 to very old, and they looked at her with the concentrated, reading attention of people who have spent a very long time assessing other people. Cale was standing to one side. He met her eyes when she came in but said nothing. Two people she did not know were standing near the elders' table. A man who had the manner of an attorney, and a woman who had the manner of someone who had decided the outcome already. These, she understood, were Bertrand's envoys. She had been told she could speak. She had been told there would be an opportunity for her to address the council. She had not been told it would feel like this, like walking into a room where the air itself was full of judgment, where the history, and the structure, and the weight of something she had only known for a few weeks, pressed down from every direction. She had not prepared a speech. She had thought about what she wanted to say. In the direct and non-performative way she thought about everything, and she had decided to say exactly that. She waited until the formal process had moved through its early stages, the reading of the claim, the statement of the objection, the laying out of the request from Bertrand's family. She listened to all of it carefully. She noted the phrasing. She noted what was emphasized and what was quietly left out. She noted that nowhere in the formal statement from Bertrand's side was the name Cora mentioned, or her preference asked for. When the senior elder turned to her and said, "You may speak," she stepped forward. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform certainty she did not have, or emotions she was not feeling. She spoke the way she always spoke when she needed to be understood exactly. She said, "I am a wildlife biologist. I have spent 12 years working in remote environments, studying living creatures. In all of that time, the most fundamental thing I have learned is that survival is not an accident. When something finds its way to you in a crisis, it is not luck. It is decision. Even when the thing making the decision cannot explain it in words." She paused. 3 weeks ago, a young man came to my door in the form I know how to recognize. He was injured. He was cold. He had chosen to drag himself toward a light in the dark, because the light meant warmth and safety. I did what anyone with medical knowledge and a warm space does in that situation. I helped him. The room was very still. She said, "I have been told that my help created a problem. I have been told that my help complicated agreements and arrangements and structures that existed before I arrived in this valley. I understand that. I respect the weight of those structures. But I will not sign a document that reframes what I did as an act of interference, because it was not interference. It was care. And I do not believe, looking around this room at people who have built their lives around the bonds between individuals and between communities, that you actually believe care is the problem here." She looked along the row of elders. Some of their faces were unreadable, some were not. She said, "If your laws create a penalty for the act of keeping a living person warm, Then your laws are what needs to be examined, not my actions. She paused. I am not signing the disclaimer. I am not doing that, but I will tell you what I will do. I will work with any of you who want to find a resolution that is genuinely fair to everyone involved, including Alan, including Cora, and including this village, which has nothing to do with any of this, and should not be bearing the weight of it. She stopped. The room was silent. She stood in the silence and let it be what it was. Then something happened that she had not anticipated. The senior elder, who had the kind of face that had probably not moved into surprise in several decades, looked at her for a long moment, and then he looked at Cale. And Cale, who had been standing to the side with his arms at his sides, and his expression controlled and careful, looked back at the elder. And neither of them spoke, but something passed between them in that silence that had the quality of an agreement being reached without words, the kind of understanding that only happens between people who have known each other long enough to speak in the space between sentences. From across the room, one of Bertrand's envoys, the woman who had the manner of someone who had already decided the outcome, said sharply, "This is highly irregular. The community's laws." "The community's laws," said the senior elder, calmly, and with a finality that closed the sentence the moment it opened it, "will be administered by this council. Thank you for your observation." The envoy pressed her mouth shut. In the long quiet that followed, Marin stood where she was and breathed. She could hear the fire at the far end of the hall. She could feel the particular weight of a room full of people who were recalibrating, quietly and internally, something they had already decided. Cale crossed the room to her. He moved without hurry, and he stopped beside her in a way that was not demonstrative, but was entirely deliberate. He said, quietly enough that only she could hear, "You said what I could not say." She looked at him. His face, in the firelight, was not the controlled and authoritative face she had seen in her cabin. It was something more complicated than that, something more human, in the deepest sense of the word, than his title usually allowed. "You could have said it," she said. "No," he said. "Not in that room. Not in that role." He paused. "But you could. And you did." She looked at him for a moment. "Why did you want me to say it?" she asked. He was quiet. Then he said, simply, and without any of the formal distance he usually carried, "Because it needed to be said, and because it was true. And those two things should be enough." She held his gaze. And for the first time since the night of the storm, the first time since the enormous gray wolf had appeared on her porch, and the world had tilted sideways and not tilted back, Marin Solberg felt something loosen in her chest. Not a resolution, not a happy ending, just the particular, specific relief of being in a room with someone who said something that was true and meant it. Outside the hall, the snow had stopped. The sky was beginning to clear. And in the morning, when the light came clean and bright over the mountain, the world was going to look very different from the way it had looked a month ago. She was not afraid of that. She was, in fact, already ready for it. The decision came 3 days after the council meeting. Cale came to her cabin alone in the early morning, without a convoy, without the two quiet men who usually stood at a respectful distance behind him. Just one man walking up the path to her door in the cold, carrying nothing in his hands except himself, which was already, she had come to understand, more than enough. She was already awake. She had been awake for a while, in fact, had been sitting at her table with her notebook open and a mug of tea going cold at her elbow, watching the morning light move across the mountain. When she heard the knock, she recognized it immediately. Not the firm, certain knock of the first time he had come. Something with more space in it, more breath. She opened the door. "Come in," she said. He sat at her table for the first time. The previous 2 times he had been here, he had stood. Now he sat, and without the formality of standing, he looked, strangely, like a man rather than a position, which was something she had suspected was there, but had not yet seen clearly. She put the kettle back on and waited. He said, "The council met yesterday evening. I withdrew the formal accusation against you." She looked at him. "I informed them," he said, "that framing your actions as an interference was inaccurate and unfair, and that the community's law, in this case, created an outcome that was unjust rather than orderly. I told them that upholding a law in a way that punishes a reasonable and humane act is not the same as upholding the law's purpose." She set 2 mugs down and poured without asking, "How did they receive that?" with varying degrees of comfort, he said. The senior elder received it well. The two youngest council members received it very well. Several of the older members received it less well, but accepted it. And Bertrand's envoys? They have returned south, he said. The formal objection has been withdrawn. She sat down across from him. How? He wrapped both hands around the mug. It was such an ordinary gesture, and so unexpectedly human, in someone who usually occupied space with such careful authority, that it stopped her thought for a second. I reminded Bertrand, he said, that the bond claim in its current form is acknowledged but suspended. Elan has not activated it. You have not activated it. Under our law, a suspended claim carries no obligation. It is a recognition, not a contract. Bertrand's arrangement with Elan's family was made in good faith, and I honored it by saying publicly that the arrangement deserved to be treated with respect. He paused. I also told Bertrand something else. She waited. I told him that his daughter Cora had never been asked what she wanted, and that if he wished to continue the arrangement, he needed to begin there. Marin looked at him for a long moment. How did he receive that? Cale's expression, which had been careful and even, shifted very slightly. Something dry moved across it. Not quite amusement, but close to it. He received it the way Bertrand receives everything he doesn't want to hear, he said, with great noise, and then, eventually, with compliance. She allowed herself a small smile, and Elan? Elan, he said, is relieved. He is back with his pack. He is rebuilding. He paused. He is, for the first time in a long while, making choices because he wants to make them. Marin held her mug and looked at the table. She thought about the young man who had sat across from her in this same cabin, with his hands wrapped around a coffee cup and his eyes carrying the weight of something he had not been asked to carry. Good, she said. They sat in a silence that was, for the first time, comfortable. The fire was going. The light was coming in clean and clear through the window, the long flat light of a northern winter morning that made everything look sharp and still and very real. Cale said, without looking up from his mug, I owe you an apology. She looked at him. I came to your door the first time, he said, and I used the word blamed. I told you that what you had done had caused consequences, and I said it in a way that placed the responsibility on you. That was not accurate, and it was not fair. He paused. I was managing a situation that I had not expected, and I handled it by assigning a cause rather than examining the system that created the problem. I know the difference usually. In this case, I chose the easier thing. Marin looked at him for a long moment. She said, Why are you telling me this? He met her eyes. Because you deserve to hear it, and because I do not say things I do not mean. She believed that. She had believed it for some time, actually, even when what he meant had been difficult to receive. She said, When you told me that the snow reveals what was already waiting, do you still believe that? He considered the question seriously, the way he seemed to consider most things, with a fullness of attention that was, she had come to understand, one of the most distinctive things about him. Yes, he said. What happened between you and Elan was not caused by the storm. It was not caused by a wound, or a blizzard, or a porch light. It was there already. The need for the community to examine things that had been too comfortable to examine. The storm just made it visible. She looked out the window at the mountain, white and immense and very still. I came here to study wolves, she said. I know, he said. I had no intention of being in the middle of anything. I know that too, he said. She looked back at him. And yet, he agreed. There was a pause, the kind of pause that is not empty but full, the kind where both people in a room are aware that something is shifting, and neither of them is certain yet what to call it. Cale said, I want to show you something. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and brought out a journal. It was old, the cover worn soft with handling, and it was thick, filled with pages that had been added to over a long period. He set it on the table between them and pushed it toward her. She looked at it. Open it, he said. She opened it. The handwriting inside was precise and careful, in a style she had not seen before, and it was accompanied by detailed field observations, sketches of tracks and behavioral notes and seasonal patterns. She turned a few pages. The observations were about wolves, the Halvord mountain range, the specific packs and their movements and their relationships over time. The data was thorough and patient, built up across what looked like many years of work. She stopped at a page near the middle of the journal. There was a sketch of a set of tracks, and beside them a measurement note. She looked at the measurements. They matched the tracks she had found on her Eastern survey. The unusually large tracks she had recorded and noted as an outlier. The ones she had been puzzling over for weeks. She looked up at him. "How long have you been keeping these records?" she asked. 30 years, he said, give or take. She looked at the journal in her hands. "Why?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because someone should. Because the mountain has a memory, and someone should be helping it keep one." A pause. "And because there are things in this particular range that deserve to be known. Not just by us, by the world. If the world is ever ready to know them." She turned another page. There were descriptions of animal behavior she had never seen in any published paper. Patterns she had been trying to explain for 3 years. Evidence that was consistent with her own data, but went further, deeper, with a context she had been missing. She looked up. "You've been watching the same things I've been watching," she said. "Yes," he said, "for 30 years. And you never published any of this." "I had no one to publish it with," he said simply, "and I was not certain the world was ready." She looked at him across the table, this complicated and careful man who had walked into her cabin a month ago with an accusation and was now sitting at her table with 30 years of field observations in a worn journal, offering them to her without asking for anything in return. She said, slowly, "What are you asking?" "Nothing," he said. "I am giving. That is different." She looked at the journal. She looked at him. Outside the window, spring was still months away. The mountain was white and cold, and full of things that had been waiting quietly in the dark and the snow, for the moment the light changed enough to call them forward. She reached across the table and placed her hand flat on the cover of the journal. "All right," she said. He nodded, once. They sat together in the warm quiet of the cabin, and the morning light came through the window and lay across the table between them, and outside the snow was melting, very slowly, 1 degree at a time, in the way that things melt when the season finally decides it is done waiting. It took longer for the thaw to come than anyone in Halvard had expected. Winter held on through March and into April, with a stubbornness that the older residents said they had not seen in 20 years, as though the mountain itself had decided to extend the season, to hold everyone in place a little longer, to make sure that whatever needed to settle had enough time to do so, before the movement of spring swept it all forward. Maren used the time. She always used whatever time she had. She went through Cale's journal systematically, cross-referencing his 30 years of observations with her own 3 years of data. The work was absorbing in the specific way that good scientific work always was, the way that pulled you forward by small increments, each answer opening 2 more questions, each confirmed pattern suggesting a structure you had not seen before. She worked long hours, often past midnight, surrounded by notebooks and field maps, and the comfortable mess of a project that was genuinely alive. Cale visited regularly, not every day, not even every week, but with the consistent rhythm of someone who had decided to be present in a particular way, and was following through on that decision. He would come in the late morning sometimes, and they would sit at the table and go through the journal together, and he would explain things that were not clear from the written notes, things that needed context she did not have. Observations that only made sense if you understood the structure of the community he had been watching alongside the wolves. He was, she discovered, a very good observer, patient and precise, and honest about uncertainty, which was rarer in scientific practice than most people admitted. He would say, often, that he was not certain about this or that piece of data, and when he said he was not certain, he actually meant it, rather than using uncertainty as a rhetorical move to avoid being wrong. She found that she looked forward to the mornings he came. She noted this in herself, with the same objectivity she tried to bring to everything, acknowledged it, set it aside, and went on working. Elan visited twice more, before the snow finally began to ease. The first time, he brought a young woman with him, someone Maren had not met before, who turned out to be from the village's younger generation, a friend of his, and they both sat at her table and ate the thick soup she kept on the stove in winter, and talked about small things, ordinary things, the kind of conversation that builds without trying to. He was lighter than he had been in January. Something in him had settled. She was glad to see it. The second time he came alone. He sat across from her and said, without any particular lead-up, that Cora had been asked what she wanted. Maren looked at him. "And?" she said. "And she had quite a lot to say," he said, with the dry, quiet humor she had come to recognize in him. "It turns out she had not wanted the arrangement either. She had been managing it the same way I was, because she thought it was what was expected. When her father came to her and said she was free to choose, she said she had already chosen someone in her own community and had been too afraid to say so." Maren was quiet for a moment. "That must have been a long year for both of you," she said. "Yes," he said, "it was." She looked at him. "Are you all right?" He considered the question honestly, the way she had come to expect from him. "I am," he said. "I am better than I was. I have room now to figure out what I actually want, rather than managing what was already decided." He paused. "I don't think I've ever had that before." "It's a good thing to have," she said. "It is," he said. "It feels strange, but good strange." She smiled. He smiled back. It was the first time she had seen him smile, without any weight behind it. And it was a different expression entirely, younger and lighter, and very genuine. He left in the early afternoon, and she stood in the doorway and watched him cross the clearing, and she thought about the night in January, when he had been carried unconscious across her floor, and she thought about how far the distance was between that night and this afternoon, and she thought that sometimes the distance a person covers in a few months of their life is longer than the distance of years. She went back to her table and picked up her pen. The spring finally arrived in the second week of April. It came the way spring always comes to the high north, not gently, but with a kind of purposeful energy. Sunlight that had real heat in it for the first time in months. A sound returning to the landscape. Water moving. Birds. The soft creak and shift of snow releasing its grip on the trees. Maren opened her windows for the first time since October and stood in the cold, fresh air and breathed. The bond claim faded, as the elders had said it would, naturally and without ceremony. In the second week after the official acknowledgement of its suspension, both Maren and Alon reported to the council separately that they felt no continuation of the recognition. The senior elder noted this in the formal record with a single line and closed the matter without further comment. It was done. What remained was everything else. What remained was a journal with 30 years of data in it, and a biologist who now had more to work with than she had ever expected. What remained was a relationship with a village that had been distant and careful, and was now something more open, the kind of openness that comes after a shared difficulty, when people have been tested together and come through on the same side. What remained was a young man who had his life back and was figuring out what to do with it. What remained was Cora, somewhere to the south, having a conversation with her family that was long overdue. And what remained was a man who came to her door on a quiet morning in the second week of April, without a convoy, without any official purpose, carrying nothing except himself. She opened the door before he knocked, because she had heard his footsteps on the path, and she had been waiting, not impatiently, but in the way you wait for something you know is coming, and are genuinely glad about. He looked at her in the spring morning light. He looked different in it than he had in the gray winter, more present somehow, more of himself. She stepped back to let him in. He stood in the doorway for a moment. "I brought you something," he said. He reached into his coat and brought out a small package wrapped in cloth, and he held it out to her. She took it and unwrapped it. Inside was a small stone carving of a wolf, very old by the look of it, smoothed by handling, the detail worn soft with time. It was simple and very beautiful. She looked at it in her palm. "It has been in my family for a long time," he said. "I want you to have it, not as a formal thing, not as a community gesture, as something from me, personally, to you." She looked at the carving, she looked at him. "Why?" she said. He said quietly, "Because you did not leave him outside, and because everything that came from that, the difficulty and the complication, and all of it, was also worth it. And I think you should have something that reminds you of that, when the winter was hard, and the spring was slow, and the outcome was not guaranteed." She held the carving, and did not say anything for a moment. She was not a person who found it easy to receive things. She was better at giving, at doing, at moving forward. Standing still and accepting something that was offered was harder. But she was learning. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He came inside. She made coffee. They sat at the table where 30 years of field notes were spread across the surface, alongside 3 years of her own records, and the morning light came through the open window, in the warm, specific way that spring light has. And outside, in the clearing, where the snow had finally released its grip, the first green things were beginning to push up through the thawed ground. She put the stone wolf on the table beside her notebook. She looked at it for a moment. Then she picked up her pen, and she and Cale Draven began to work, together, on the kind of record that takes more than one person to build. The kind that requires both the inside view and the outside view. The kind that can only exist when two different ways of understanding the world decide to try to understand it together. Outside, the mountain was waking up. The birches were already showing the first pale gold of new leaves. The ravens were back in the pines. Somewhere on the eastern slope, in the deep and patient quiet of the old forest, a pack was moving through the morning, and the sound of them, faint and steady and very much alive, reached the open window of the cabin, and came inside, and filled the room with something that was not quite a sound, and not quite a feeling, but was, unmistakably, a presence. Maren paused in her writing for a moment. She listened. Then she smiled, very quietly, to herself, and she went back to work.